Okay, to start off, who can actually apply to become a sponsorship agreement holder? An organization can apply to become a sponsorship agreement holder. So individuals who are self-employed that are the only person for their company, they cannot apply to become a SAW because sponsorship agreement holders are considered to be numerous people submitting and working on multiple applications every year. And so a single individual is not going to be able to apply to become a sponsorship agreement holder. You would need to have at least one other person, preferably more people than just the two of you. And this organization that wants to apply must be incorporated for at least 2 years. And so the incorporation must be either provincially or federally. Any organizations that do not meet the 2-year incorporation, they cannot actually submit a co-signed application with another organization. And so you as an organization would actually need to apply for incorporation and then wait until you've achieved 2 years of incorporation and generate a financial history before applying to become a SAW. So partnering with another organization that does have financial capacity and has been incorporated for 2 years, you can't do that. You have to actually apply yourselves, or that organization would need to become the SAW. It's pretty important to IRCC that any organization who wants to apply to become a SAW already have direct experience with private sponsorship and the settlement of refugees. IRCC will typically refuse an application where there's no demonstration of that kind of experience by the individuals who are named in the organization's application. We'll talk about who needs to be named in the application, but all of those persons named in the application, there should be some people who have direct experience with settling refugees and also the process of submitting applications. There are quite a few application requirements. Once you've met the eligibility requirement of being an incorporated organization for at least 2 years and having settlement experience working with privately sponsored refugees, you're going to need to ensure that you have some documents included with your application. And we're going to go through those right now. So let's talk about articles of incorporation or letters patent. So these are legal documents issued by the federal, provincial, or territorial governments for you to be approved to be incorporated as an organization. And so when you applied to become incorporated, you submitted those articles of incorporation or letters patent, and those government bodies would have approved you. And if you didn't retain those approved documents, you can certainly request a copy from the department for which you had originally applied for incorporation. You'll see in the image here to the right, there are some examples of what those look like, but it should be an official legal document that declares that you are incorporated. And it typically shows you the name of the organization, the address information, and the names and addresses for the directors or the persons who had applied for the incorporation, as well as the date of incorporation. And so if you're unsure if your document meets the requirements, IRCC is asking that you please do your research in advance of submitting your application, or it will be considered incomplete if it's not the correct document. So it is the responsibility of the applying organization to make sure that their document is an article of incorporation or a letters patent. And so some organizations in the past have thought that their tax forms, since they list their number, their incorporation number, that would be sufficient. However, this is not an acceptable replacement for the articles of incorporation or the letters patent. You would need to have one of those two proof documents because the other documents don't contain the relevant information that IRCC is looking for. Financial statements. You're expected to provide a financial record of your organization. Organizations must submit with their application an audited financial statement for the most recent full fiscal year period. And the audit would ideally be completed in 2022. However, audited financial statements that were completed at the end of 2021 may be accepted. And this really depends on your fiscal year end. IRCC wants to be sure that you're submitting a most recent audited financial statement that has been completed within 6 months of your organization's fiscal year end. And so I want to talk a little bit about that handout that you would have downloaded, that is the chart for your fiscal year end. This chart, the green sections, indicates the time of year, depending on your fiscal year end, which is the column on the left. It will tell you that that would be a safe time frame for you to have the audited financial statement. Any of the boxes that are in yellow indicates it might be risky because you may not be able to get your audited statement completed in time for submission to IRCC. There's a deadline when applications have to be submitted. Typically, the application window opens between May and July. And so, for example, if your organization's fiscal year end is April, let's say that, that only gives you 3 months to get that audited financial statement completed and for you to submit your application to IRCC. And so in that case, IRCC would expect that you would do your best to get it completed and have it scheduled with your certified professional accountant in time to have it submitted. And so check the chart, find out when your fiscal year end is, and find the most ideal time for you to submit your application. So again, I mentioned it must be the most recent 1 full year, fiscal year. And these are the kinds of documents that cannot be accepted in place of the audited financial statement. So there's something called a notice to reader. So basically that would be a narrative by someone in the organization saying, here's the financial standing of our organization. That kind of document would not be acceptable in place of the audited financial statement. Review engagement reports. So, for example, if there's a report that goes to the board of directors internally talking about the financial status of the organization, this again would not be acceptable in place of the audited financial statement. So bank statements alone without the audit report from the auditor would not be acceptable on their own, nor would QuickBook reports or tax forms. So again, IRCC is adamant that organizations applying to become a sponsorship agreement holder will need to provide the audited financial statements. It's important to know that it must be an independent audit. So you may have somebody in your organization who is qualified to do financial audits. You would not be able to use them to do the audit for your organization. It would need to be done independently, apart from your organization, somebody who's not associated with your organization at all. And it must be conducted by a chartered public accountant. So a general accountant is not authorized to do audited financial statements. So it has to be someone with the designation of a CPA. And again, in line with the understanding that someone within your organization cannot do the audit, you cannot have an internal audit submitted. It does have to be an independent audit by a CPA. And the CPA must be a member in good standing of an institute or association of accountants within that province or territory. And the CPA must meet any qualifications for performing audits, and the audit must conform to current CPA Canada audit reporting standards. And IRCC is actually going to verify with the relevant provincial body to confirm that the person who conducted the audit is a CPA and is authorized to conduct audits. And so just a note from IRCC, submitting falsely audited financial statements will not only result in a negative or incomplete decision on your application, It may also negatively impact future applications. There have been organizations in the past who have tried to submit fraudulent documentation, unfortunately. So I'm sure you all know this, submitting fraudulent documents is not going to be accepted. So I know you're all thinking to yourself, well, we are a non-profit organization, a charitable organization. Are we not exempt from audited financial statements? We've never gotten one before. Well, IRCC does recognize that for charitable organizations, you may have never acquired one before because CPA audited statements aren't necessary for CRA agency filing. This isn't a requirement of CRA, it's actually a requirement to apply to become a SAW. IRCC wants to ensure that the organization is a legal organization and that they do have sufficient funds. And they want to see that the funds that have gone through the organization have been done in such a way that is acceptable to CRA. And so that's part of the application process, whether or not you have to submit to CRA or not. And so just to give you an idea of the cost of an audit, most small organizations who have very little cash flow, so basically there will not be a lot of things for the CPA to audit, they range between $1,500 and $3,000 for a 1-year fiscal year financial audit. Now, if you're a mid-sized organization with a bit more cash flow, then those could range between $4,000 and $8,000. Proof of Canadian status. The ID documentation that the individuals are submitting must provide proof of Canadian status, such as your citizenship card or permanent residence card or Indian status card. And so just a note on who to include, you would want to have the head of the organization. So for example, the president or CEO or equivalent position of the organization has to be included on the application. And so they have to provide proof of Canadian status. You also need to provide information about the main contact person. So the person who answers the phones and emails for the organization. Now that may be the same person as the head of the organization, and that's okay. You just want to make sure that you're going to have at least 2 persons named on the application in order to show IRCC that you are not a one-person organization attempting to do sponsorship. That won't be allowed. And in fact, to have your application stronger, you want to have multiple persons listed as members of your organization. That shows IRCC that you understand that private sponsorship is not to be undertaken by 1 or 2 people alone. It is a group endeavor. And so as a minimum, however, IRCC requires that the head of the organization, the main contact, and also any intended signing authorities for the organization. So in a typical SAW that exists right now, those organizations would have persons who are delegated to run the sponsorship program for the organization. And so the head of the organization would designate signing authority to individuals who actually do the work of processing the applications and submitting the applications. And so you would name those signing authorities for the organization in addition to the head of the organization and the main contact. But again, as a reminder, you will not want to submit your application where you're naming only one person who does everything. And it would not be considered a strong application if you are only naming 2 persons for your organization. I would say a strong application IRCC would consider would have at least 5 persons named for the organization, because when you think about other types of sponsorships, they are called groups of 5. And that's for a reason, because it takes at least 5 people to help with sponsorship. And when you become a sponsorship agreement holder, you're going to be submitting sponsorships for multiple families, multiple individuals. The existing sponsorship agreement holders, they submit for between 25 and over 100 individuals each year. So we're not talking about submitting just 1 or 2 sponsorship applications a year. These are organizations that have a mission and intention to submit for many applications each year. Each of those individuals you're naming on the application have to submit a sponsor assessment form. And so each person designated to sign these SAW undertakings, so the signing authorities will each need to provide one, as well as the head of the organization and the main contact. And just to be aware, this requirement applies for any signing representatives that are appointed in the future as well. So let's say you had somebody who was running your program at the time you were approved and you had a replacement, then you would need to have that person submit a sponsorship assessment form when they start. And for all those persons I had mentioned previously, the head of the organization, the main contact, and intended signing authorities for the organization, they each need to have a criminal record check, a cleared non-vulnerable sector search record check. So IRCC is only requiring as a minimum the criminal record check, but if you have the non-vulnerable sector search police check, then you can send that one in as long as it's within 6 months of the application submission date. So anything that was dated more than 6 months cannot be submitted. They will not be accepted. The SAW application form, these forms are going to be released every single year, brand new. So you cannot submit the previous year's forms. So if you had applied to become a SAW in 2021, if they're not accepted and they want to reapply in 2022, they can't simply resubmit the forms from 2021. You will have to download the new forms for 2022, which will not become available until the application window opens. And we're expecting that the application window will open sometime between May and July. That's our anticipated time. And so when that happens, those forms at the bottom, the forms are called IMM 0109. They will have a month date here. I don't know what the month date is because we don't have the forms yet, but it'll say, for example, 03 or 04. And then you'll see that it'll say -2022. You need to make sure that you have the copy of the 2022 application forms. And you'll download those from the IRCC website. And again, just to reiterate, older versions of this form are not acceptable. So supporting documentation. You want to provide supporting documentation that shows IRCC you have proof of what you're saying in your application. So let's talk about what some of that supporting documentation is. First off, you want to prove that you have sponsorship and settlement experience. And so as I mentioned earlier on, IRCC evaluates candidate organizations on their previous settlement experience. And if your organization has not engaged in private sponsorship before, your weighted score may not be sufficient to be approved to become a SAW. Now, you can gain experience by engaging in a group of 5 sponsorship or community sponsorship, or you can sponsor under a current sponsorship agreement holder as a constituent group. And your experience should include processing of applications and on-the-ground settlement experience of the members of the organization who are named on the application to become a SAW. Now, you may also want to get letters of recommendation if you had applied under a sponsorship agreement holder who is already existing. They may give you a letter of recommendation that might be helpful in addition to actual examples of settlement experiences provided. So basically, support what you're saying as it relates to your sponsorship experience with supporting information. So for example, you may want to provide a list of the G numbers of the persons you've previously sponsored before. And that alongside with the recommendation letter, if you had sponsored under sponsorship agreement holder, that may add weight to your settlement experience section. You also want to give a demonstration of your financial capacity. And so to do so, you would need to explain and provide documentation to show IRCC how you will generate funds to support multiple application submissions each year. And you also want to show that you have a way to sustain sources of funding. So even though you may have a few $1,000s in your account to support one sponsorship for your first year, you want to give an explanation and proof documentation to show that you have sustainable sources of funding to do more sponsorships in following years. And you also want to provide proof of your current address for the representatives. Additional documentation, ID, such as your driver's license that shows the current residential address should be included as well. But if you don't happen to have a driver's license or any ID, official ID that shows your current residential address, then you can provide other supporting documents. For example, the lease agreement for where you live. That would show your name and the address of the place that you're renting. Okay, and finally, the other requirement is that you need to provide proof that you have taken the mandatory training course with RSTP. All those persons named on the application, so the head of the organization, the main contact, and any intended signing authorities for the organization are each required to take the training and independently pass the course in order to receive the certificate. And each of those persons' certificates must be included with the application. And of course, they need to be submitted with the application before the application deadline. So for the mandatory training course, it takes approximately 6 hours for you to complete, depending on how long it takes you to read materials and understand them. And there is no limit on the number of persons that you can have enrolled in the training for your organization. So you can have more than those 3 named positions taking the training. They can just do the training as a way to demonstrate to IRCC that you are committed to having your team members trained. Each person must participate independently. So you can't do group responses. So an example of what a group response would be is one person in the organization says, okay, I've done the final exam. Here's what the questions are. Here's what your answers are. I'm going to give you the answers to the final exam. That can't happen. Of course, obviously, that wouldn't be acceptable. So you do need to have a 60% passing grade to receive your certificates. I should mention that there are modules that break the information up into segments, and each of those modules has a quiz. It's usually between 5 questions and 10 questions. And so the grades for those and the grade for the final exam are combined together to give you your final grade. And so the 60% pass is for the final exam, and overall, you should have a 60% passing grade. So what if your organization is not eligible? So you're not an organization that has been incorporated for at least 2 years, or perhaps you know that your membership for your organization can't afford to invest in the audited financial statements, which, I should mention is also a requirement for sponsorship agreement holders. So you wouldn't be getting that audited financial statement just to apply. You're going to need to get an audited financial statement moving forward as long as you remain a sponsorship agreement holder. And perhaps you don't have any private sponsorship experience right now. If that's the case, you may want to consider community sponsorship instead. So there's no need to be incorporated or to provide audited financial statements from a CPA in order to submit a community sponsorship. You may want to wait a couple of years until you have a stronger application and much more experience. And just a final word, there are very few SAW applicants that actually meet the requirements and are approved each year. IRCC takes a look at not only the applicant to see that they meet all of the requirements, but they also have to take a look at the location where that organization is. And they compare how many other sponsorship agreement holders they have in that location and whether there's a need for an additional one in that particular geographic location.